If you could read only 5 books in your life, what would they be? What a wonderful question to be asked. So, I've been wondering how to structure an answer to this question, and I think it's probably best to address it in 5 specific areas with overlapping themes because I don't just exist as Billy, as one big block that goes throughout life. There is also the physical side of me, there's the emotional side of me, there's the mental, there's the spiritual, and I'm also going to include in here as well the shadow side of me. So as a minimum, I'm a community of 5 mini Billies, if you like, and I can't reduce one part down to another without something fundamental being lost. So those are the 5 areas that I want to break down, and I want to give a book recommendation for each in this lesson as well to make it as useful as possible. And I'm going to include an absolute ton of quotes from these books as well. So by all means, use these as little reflective pieces in and of themselves. So with all this in mind, let's start with the physical side of life. And for the physical side, I'm going to recommend Pleasure by Alexander Lowen. Now, I've really enjoyed how this goes into just absolutely massive amount of detail on things like the idea of pleasure and what that looks like on the biological level, how things like breathing and muscular tension and nervous system regulation are all important on the physical level, how all of this relates and has an impact on your self-identity, and how you can actually use a lot of this to process things like guilt and shame. So you can start to see with some of these headings as I'm just scrolling through it all now as well. And it's also making it really clear why self-expression is important and why we need to be a bit more in touch with our inner signals and learn how to interpret them. Just ultimately, how to live a more creative life rather than a destructive one. So, like a lot of books that are going to be on this list, this is going to be one where you really want to sit with it rather than just race through it. And for me, every single chapter has just been absolutely jam-packed with so much wisdom, and I can just see how practical how practical a lot of this is as well. So it's not just theory for the sake of theory, but you can actually see how it's relevant on a daily basis. So this is very much ticking the physical box, but so much of it is also looking at how to emotionally process a lot of your experience as well, which has massive crossovers with the second book on this list. And I've decided to settle on Complex PTSD by Pete Walker for this emotional one. Now, quick note just to call this out early on, this isn't only useful for people who are struggling with major trauma or complex PTSD. Like, yes, it's obviously going to help if that's relevant, but I found this to be just really personally useful to manage anything that might be considered overwhelming or that takes me away from the present moment and start to ruminate on the past. Or just sometimes when I'm gripped emotionally by something and I don't even know what it is, it's just a really heavy and uncomfortable feeling. So as a quick flick through on things like this book has helped me to manage my inner voices and outer voices, especially inner critic and outer critic voices, to manage emotional flashbacks, which essentially referring to those times where you feel really vulnerable or lost or stuck, mainly when you're stuck with shameful or fear-based thoughts. I'll put a big picture on that to do with that in a second. It's helped me to manage grief and to also realize what like forgiveness looks like in terms of like real forgiveness rather than just fake forgiveness. It's also given me quite a realistic timeline and trajectory of what healing looks like as well, whatever that word might mean for you. So I found that the more I've become settled in my body, then the more I've been able to accurately interpret what my emotions or sensations are trying to tell me. Or at the very least, I've got a better idea of what might be going on. So even if you just stopped the lesson here and you read both Pleasure and Complex PTSD, that's going to give you a pretty massive foot in the door for your inner work or your self-discovery or your self-mastery or personal development or whatever term feels right for you. Because once you're most grounded in reality, or once you're more grounded in reality and in the present, it's going to be a lot easier to think clearly. And that brings us on to the next topic. So I'm a very visual person. So any image or diagram or flowchart or schematic, anything like that helps me picture what the author is trying to say clearly. That's going to be really useful for somebody like me. So for the mental aspect, I've tried to pick a book that has the most useful diagrams to help plot a bigger picture of the structures that explain what's going on inside a person, which is exactly why I've gone with Psychosynthesis, A Psychology of the Spirit by John Furman and Anne Gieler. Now, the language is more technical in this book compared to the other two, but it is just such a wonderful overview and walkthrough of the ideas within psychosynthesis, which is something I talk about quite a lot on this channel as well. Now, if you're already familiar with shadow work and Carl Jung, it's essentially, for me at least, a more fleshed out version of that. So it's helped me to understand quite a lot of things. Like if we go back to page 20, I was going to refer to exactly this. So it's helped me understand that I don't just have an unconscious versus conscious mind, but instead there is a higher, a lower, and a middle unconscious. And it's helped me to locate where different experiences are and where these different thoughts and emotions would be on a map like this. And how all of this has helped to shape my personality and how I take more control over that process in the future by linking all these different fragments of me together. And it's also helped to explain why I have various coping mechanisms and what they're trying to achieve, but maybe just in a bit of a maladaptive kind of way. And how all of this overall really, it relates to self-realization or self-actualization. Now I've made a little note of some of the diagrams which I found particularly useful. So you might like some of these as well. Like I say, on page 20, we've got this famous egg diagram, which is a really good starting point to help start to plot out all of these different experiences that I've just mentioned. If we jump way further ahead to page 72, get that on the screen for you so you can see what's going on. Then there's a good introduction to the idea of sub-personalities and what makes up a particular part of myself. On page 88, there is a good visual to show how all these different personalities have their unrealized heights in the higher unconscious, but how they stretch into the lower unconscious as well. And then if you jump really further ahead now to page 152, like I said, I made a few notes on the pages just to make this a little bit easier. There we go. Then you can start to see how all of this relates to personality, specifically how it relates to a survival-based personality rather than authentic personality. So in other words, basically what gets left out on both extremes and how all of this is actually kept in place as well. Now I've tried to avoid a lot of the jargon here, but it is all explained just so wonderfully by John Furman and Anne Gieler. And there's a lot of diagrams in this, but I'm going to leave it there because there is a natural bridge here to the spiritual book recommendation. Now, it was quite difficult to pick a book for this one because the word spiritual in itself is a little bit problematic. Everyone's going to understand it in just so many different ways. So I'm going to try to keep it as broad and as consistent with these other books as possible so far. So with that in mind, I'm not talking about a specific religion, but instead the idea that there is something more to being a human than what we see on a daily basis. So rather than using religious specific language, I'm referring instead to things like the transpersonal or the self-transcending aspects of being a person. Anything that goes beyond the individual ego and starts to think a little bit bigger. So I'm going to offer two books for this section with that in mind. Firstly, we've got The Religion of Tomorrow by Ken Wilber. Where do I even begin with this? Right. Like you can just see, it's an absolute beast of a book. Essentially, Ken Wilber is arguing that as we develop and as we mature, there's always going to be a major problem or a major hurdle to overcome. So we need to be aware of what these hurdles actually look like so that we can actually manage them rather than being just overwhelmed by them. So basically, amongst many other things, there's a big difference between the structure of consciousness of different levels and the state of being in that consciousness. And there's always going to be a worldview associated with every single level and a problem or a blind spot associated with each of these as well. And a decent chunk of this book is actually on shadow work itself. So that crosses over quite nicely into the next topic. But I am also very mindful as I'm flicking through this, there's going to be a lot of people watching this and thinking, right, there's a massive 800-page book here. Great. I'm never actually going to get around to reading it though, or finishing it. So I would like to challenge that thought, but maybe just on another video. You can absolutely do it. You can absolutely read something massive, just got to break it all down. But for a more manageable read on something like this, I would instead suggest something like The Farther Reaches of Human Nature by Abraham Maslow. Now, I'm considering this book spiritual in the sense of going beyond the average everyday experience of what it is to be a human. And Maslow is arguing that beyond self-actualization, there's actually another step, which is self-transcendence. Basically, beyond growing just for yourself, eventually you'll find the need or the pull to be of service to others. Or just by being such a fantastic person to be around, other people are going to be naturally inspired by your example, whether you're consciously aware of that or not. So in terms of crossing over with the themes of the mental section of this lesson, just by knowing things like being motivation and deficiency motivation and meta motivation more widely, and on being a creative person and the blocks around it, and on what being a self-actualizing individual even means, just by literally being aware of these ideas, they can act as a really good anchor towards a better future for yourself. And it becomes a lot easier to know what it is that you're actually trying to work towards. Again, it's by giving yourself a good map mentally so that you know where to make sense of all these different experiences emotionally, because all of these are going to have relevant physical aspects as well. That's what I was saying before about these different aspects of what it is to be a person. So that brings us on quite nicely to our final area, which is the shadow. I'm going to keep this one simple. So on the screen, first of all, I'm going to put on my favourite, just simplified definition of what shadow work refers to. So by all means, pause the video to read that if you're not quite sure what I'm referring to. But it's this idea of the repressed unconscious, which is going to have all kinds of impacts on us. Again, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. So we need a good overview of shadow work to see what's most relevant to us at any given point and which glues all of this together. Which is why I'm going with Meeting the Shadow. It's an essay collection by Connie Zweig and Jeremiah Abrams? I think it's Abrams. So for me, this has been really, really useful because essentially what I've done over time is I've just moved the focus of what shadow work is going to be from my family to my body to work and achievement. Sometimes it's on a bit of a wider collective level when I think about good versus evil. Essentially, the point of an essay collection like this is to act as a bit of a launch pad of ideas. So you can see throughout all of this, there are some essays that I've quite heavily highlighted and some that I just haven't whatsoever. That's going to be quite natural for an essay collection. So let me just show you how I've actually used something like this and how I use just essay collections in general. So first of all, really obviously, I read the entire collection and then I highlight the key parts, which is what you're seeing on here. And I've made a couple of notes here and there as to where it's relevant. And then what I do is I go back to the contents page and I highlight all of my favourite essays. And there's only going to be a few, the ones that really stand out in comparison to others. And given that these essays came from books, which again are also named in the bibliography at the back of the book, so there's like, for example, all the different copyright information is all going to be on here, then what I end up with is basically a short list of books to dive into. So if I just pick this one, for example, about Ken Wilber, if I jump to page 272, 3, what was it? Yeah, there we go, 273. So what I've done is here, I've already made a little note of this, and I really enjoyed this essay by Ken Wilber, and then that got me started on a journey which led me to finding out about the religion of tomorrow. And within that book, that also starts to reference Abraham Maslow. And again, his ideas, especially around paying attention to your inner signals, that is very much what pleasure and complex PTSD were referring to. So really, everything starts to flow together in a very, very natural way. And hopefully, none of these books in my library, they stand alone, and that's going to become a lot clearer over time. Or at least, hopefully, clearer to me at the very least. Let's just see where all this goes. But there you go. 5 books, potentially 6, if you want to break down that spiritual section into 2. That might take you 2 months to get through. It might take you 6. It might take you a full year to get through them. It doesn't matter. It's going to be worthwhile because these are going to help you on this wonderfully deep journey of inner work or self-exploration or, like I say, whatever you might want to refer to it as. I've actually made a separate video on how to start a sustainable reading habit as well. So if you're wondering how to begin, you might enjoy that lesson as well. But I'm going to leave that one there for now, and I will see you in a future lesson. See you then.